Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris and I am president of the City Club's Board of Directors. I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, Neal, president and co-founder of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, or from this point on, ACTA. As stated at its website, ACTA, quote, is an independent, nonprofit organization committed to academic freedom, excellence, and accountability of America's colleges and universities, end quote. On academic freedom, the website states that the ideas of academic freedom and free speech are at the core of the American academic tradition. Teachers must be free to teach, students must be free to learn, and freedom in research is essential to the advancement of truth. So, today's forum offers a wonderful opportunity to juxtapose freedom of speech and academic freedom, and to reflect for just a moment on our 102-year history here at the City Club of Cleveland. We proudly refer to the City Club as the Citadel of Free Speech, but we experienced some growing pains in our early years. In 1923, the City Club invited famous labor leader, socialist, and perennial presidential candidate Eugene Debs to speak, and he accepted. The prospect of Mr. Debs speaking created a rupture in our then fledgling organization, with the board president actually refusing to do the introduction. Ultimately, I can't imagine that happening, but ultimately, Mr. Debs determined to decline the invitation, and he wrote to the City Club that he was, quote, feeling disinclined to obtrude where there is any question of my being welcome or as to the right of being heard in a forum avowedly open to free speech, end quote. The academic world has recently seen several high-profile challenges to freedom of speech. In May, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice declined an invitation to give the commencement address at Rutgers following student and faculty protests over the Bush administration's war in Iraq and use of waterboarding to obtain information from detainees. Ms. Rice noted that her invitation to speak had become a distraction for what should be, as she put it, a joyous celebration for graduates and their families. She referred to her 30 years as a professor and also to her service as provost and chief academic officer at Stanford University, and stated that, quote, I am honored to have served my country. I have defended America's belief in free speech and the exchange of ideas, end quote. Faculty and student protests also led to speakers declining commencement address invitations this year at Smith College and Haverford College. In the Haverford case, the school president issued the following statement after the former chancellor at the University of California, Berkeley declined to speak. Quote, though we may not always agree with those in positions of leadership, I believe that it is essential for us as members of an academic community to reaffirm our shared commitment to the respectful and mindful process by which we seek to learn through inquiry and intellectual engagement, end quote. And that brings us to Ms. Neal. She is prominent nationally in higher education reform, has published widely and appeared frequently on radio and television, you name it, she's been on it, CNN, Fox, NPR, and others. She twice was appointed to the National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity, which advises the U.S. Secretary of Education on federal accreditation. She earned her undergraduate degree from Harvard College and her law degree from Harvard Law School, where she was president of the Harvard Journal on Education. And she practiced law in private practice as a First Amendment and communications lawyer. So she's done a lot of stuff in her short existence. I am pleased to present on behalf of the City Club of Cleveland, Neal, president of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni.
Thank you so much. It really is a treat to be here, and I must say I like any organization that begins free speech with a gong. I think we should start doing this everywhere. And as I did my research on the City Club, I really was so impressed and amazed to see really a beacon of the free exchange of ideas for so long. In fact, given your past history and given your principles, I don't really think I need to make a statement at all, but I will in any event. I want to start today by going back to Imperial Rome. Laughing at the wrong joke could cost a man his life during the reign of corrupt and crazy Emperor Nero. Let's scroll back to the year 65 or thereabouts. Upon making a gastrointestinal noise, let us call it farting, In one of Rome's public latrines, the poet Lucan quoted a verse that Nero himself had proudly composed on the breaking of thunder. The reaction was something that only Monty Python could imagine, and yet it actually happened. Romans scrambled to put on their togas and get out of the potty, lest a tattling informer find them smiling and charge them with treason. Hilarious, except the executions and forced suicides were not. Nowadays, inappropriate laughter may not be a problem in public latrines, but any number of politically incorrect observations can bring blacklisting, disinvitations, and other punishments on our college campuses. Campus sensitivities are on high alert, and the topics that are potentially offensive and increasingly off limits are growing. Now, you've heard the term disinvitation season. This is part of that phenomenon. Choosing a campus speaker used to be about hearing a distinguished person, often someone who had taken a controversial stance. But on the politically correct campus, many students and faculty now are less interested in hearing a challenging perspective than they are in what the Huffington Post has called freedom from unpalatable speech. As you just heard, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice had to bow out at speaking at Rutgers after students protested she was a war criminal. Brandeis University invited human rights activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali to speak and receive an honorary degree, and then rescinded the invitation over student protest. Azusa Pacific University invited scholar Charles Murray to give a talk, in this case not a commencement address, then backed out because Murray, an eminent American social scientist, was too controversial. Christine Lagarde, first female head of the International Monetary Fund, was invited to speak to the graduating class at Smith, only to break out after students protested her support of imperialist and patriarchal regimes. On the PC campus, shouting down a controversial voice is not necessarily seen as an evil, but a virtue. A small group of closed-minded students and faculty is all that is needed to cut off discussion on the grounds that their view, the correct view, is the only view. Warning, trigger warning. This speech may contain traumatic subject matter for those who believe our colleges and universities have an obligation to foster a robust exchange of ideas in the pursuit of truth. Now, it wasn't always this way. Back in December 1820, as he founded the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson laid out the foundation of academic freedom. The university will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind, he wrote. For here we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor to tolerate any error so long as reason is left free to combat it. Again, in 1859, John Stuart Mill outlined the matter eloquently. The peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from this opinion still more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. Again, in 1915, the American Association of University Professors issued its seminal Declaration of Principles, defining academic freedom as a two-way street: students' freedom to learn and faculty's freedom to teach. The professor's business, they wrote, is not to provide his students with ready-made conclusions, but to train them to think for themselves, and to provide them access to those materials which they need if they are to think intelligently. Now, for many years, there was a fairly uniform agreement among academics that nothing is more central to the life of the mind than the robust exchange of ideas. The professoriate resisted, properly, when it was threatened. Yet over the last 50 years, the concept of academic freedom has been under attack, and attack from within. In its place has been an academic regime that has regularly put sensitivities and civility first and free speech second. The notions of truth and objectivity, the very conditions that underscore the academic freedom definition of Thomas Jefferson, are regularly regarded today as antiquated and an obstacle to social change. Political correctness has many formulations, but for the purposes today, it is the notion that certain areas of life and thought have only one acceptable point of view. In other words, there is no need to search for truth because the institution has already determined what the truth is. Political correctness has provided the impetus for all too many university administrations to punish students and even faculty members for expressing certain offensive thoughts, often touching race, gender, sexual orientation, and other hot-button contemporary topics. Now today, a student or faculty member found to have deviated from the reigning orthodoxy, far from being praised, can find himself ridiculed or even sentenced to sensitivity training, or worse. The PC mentality is alive and well. Now what we see, as I will outline in just the next few minutes, is the weakening of the core curriculum, the disappearance of academic disciplines and perspectives, the emergence of speech codes, and trigger warnings. The tragic consequences are not only to weaken liberal arts education, but to shortchange students for the future, and ultimately, I would submit, to undermine our competitiveness. So let's start with college curricula. At one time, faculty and administrators had the courage to define what is great and what is most important for students to know and to be able to do. Students could make some choices, but they started with a largely prescribed liberal arts curriculum leading to a major that would equip them to partake in the common conversation of well-educated people. Not today. A major like English today is not so much a body of important writers, genres, and works, but a hodgepodge of courses reflecting the diverse interests and approaches of the faculty. Shakespeare, Milton, Chaucer are no longer required in many places, but non-canonical traditions, underrepresented cultures, and ethnic or non-Western literature are. Advocacy, therapy, and sensitivity training regularly supplant rigorous intellectual training. So let's look for a few minutes at a few courses, all of which I think individually are quite fine courses, but the question is, should this be a student's only exposure? So for starters, we'll look at Union College. Students there can substitute such courses as Narratives of Haunting in U.S. Ethnic Literature for Foreign Language Study. At Wellesley, Rainbow Cowboys and Girls, Gender, Race, Class, and Sexuality in Westerns will satisfy the language and literature requirement. At UC Boulder, the U.S. context requirement may be satisfied by horror films and American culture. And my favorite at Elmira College, where the U.S. culture and civilization requirement can be met by mental illness in the media. If you are a freshman at the University of Denver, the first year seminar may be satisfied by taking Gender, Power, and Pop Culture, Decoding Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And this is such a growing genre on college campuses that my organization looks forward to doing a special column on Halloween on these courses. Now, while most content on the PC campus is equal, sensibilities are not. At Ohio State, the course on Sociology of Asian American Life is designed to sensitize students to issues facing Asian Americans. A lab of her own at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs satisfies the natural science requirement while providing students, and I quote, with modern concepts of science and mathematics with an emphasis on women's contributions to these fields. This course will also offer a feminist critique of the traditional methods of science. And let me remind you, that is in place or in favor of the natural science requirement. At college today, one cannot assume that learning is for learning's sake either. Education is often directed towards a predetermined conclusion, where students become change agents to promote a political agenda. If, for example, you enroll in the social justice minor program at the University of Minnesota and register for the color of public policy, the professor has already reached a conclusion for you, advising students in the catalog that they will be introduced to the structural and institutional conditions through which people of color have been systematically marginalized. To obtain credit, a student must also engage in 30 hours of service learning in social justice organizations. Yes, I think we can all agree that in years past, our college curricula have too often marginalized minority groups and provided a portrait that failed to outline the complex story that is our past. But in the rush to expand that story, much of the old story has been left out, leaving students and citizens with only part of that sweeping narrative and one packed with a tightly controlled political agenda. The survey conducted by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni annually of more than 1,000 liberal arts colleges around the country finds that a mere 18% expect their graduates to take a broad survey in American history or government before graduating. A mere 13% require knowledge of foreign language. A mere 3% require the study of economics. Now, some students may end up with a rich, coherent education that prepares them for life and citizenship, but it is clear they will have to find it for themselves. For as little as $200,000 today, our colleges are asking students to construct their own curriculum, and that curriculum is often quite narrow. Given this state of affairs, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni asked the Roper Survey Organization to assess recent college graduates' feelings about their education. The survey came back, and I think what it found was quite interesting. Faced with the challenges of finding a job, recent college graduates lamented in large numbers, 70%, the absence of a strong core curriculum and exposure to a broad base of foundational subjects. As one student recounted, "I took a lot of courses. I just wish they had amounted to something." An even more pernicious byproduct of the PC campus is the veritable disappearance of academic disciplines and perspectives. Casey Johnson is a terrific young historian at Brooklyn College, whose many publications include books published by both Cambridge and Harvard University presses, as well as co-authored the book Until Proven Innocent about the Duke lacrosse case. Now, Casey has studied the challenge to disciplinary diversity caused by political correctness. And what he finds, I think, is most alarming. In the last generation, he writes, with accelerating speed, the percentage of professors trained in areas of U.S. history some would deem traditional and others would dismiss as the study of dead white men has plummeted. Even those who remain in the subfields often have revisioned their topics to make them little more than a permutation on the race, class, gender approach that dominates the contemporary history profession. The result is that even students who want to encounter courses taught by those trained in U.S. political, diplomatic, constitutional, or military history are often unable to do so, although I am happy to say that students who go to Ohio State are an exception in this regard, because OSU has remained very, very diverse in its history. None other than former Harvard President Larry Summers has acknowledged this problem, stating that the threat is less from overreaching administrations and trustees than it is from prevailing faculty orthodoxies that make it very difficult for scholars holding certain views to advance in certain fields. Pro-Israel scholars, he argues, find no home in Middle Eastern studies, and American historians whose scholarship celebrates aspects of America's past too often find themselves as pariahs in their field. The PC culture of sensitivity permeates almost all of the American Academy, but nowhere is it more profound than when it comes to campus speech codes and the tribunals that enforce them. Each year, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education issues a spotlight on the state of free speech on our nation's campuses. And this year, FIRE surveyed over 400 schools and found that nearly 60% maintained severely restricted red light speech codes. And how do they define red light? They define it as policies that clearly and substantially restrict protected speech. Now, these policies, as one might imagine, are not called gag orders or censorship policies. In the PC world, The speech codes come with benign names, like anti-harassment policies, anti-bullying policies, policies on tolerance, respect, and civility, policies on bias and hate speech, policies governing speakers, demonstrations, and rallies. Speech codes are not meant to restrict speech. They are meant to ensure tolerance and civility. You may be surprised that FIRE has determined that Case Western, Kenyon, Oberlin, Ohio University, Shawnee State, Ohio State, University of Cincinnati, University of Toledo, Wright State, and Youngstown State all have red light speech codes. And again, that means clearly and substantially restricting protected speech. Now, for today's purposes, I'm going to look at just one, this one at Ohio State. The code begins with a statement: sexual harassment is illegal. But for you lawyers in the room, the succeeding definition is broad and the distinction between harassment and free speech anything but clear. Prohibited sexual harassment includes, and I quote, sexual jokes, innuendos, gestures, unwanted flirtation, advances or propositions, leering, and any unnecessary unwanted physical contact. Little did we realize in those dating days of yore that an awkward date was in fact cause for litigation. The federal government has recently put a gun to the head of campuses if they don't regularly and fully report sexual assault, including sexual harassment. And applying the policy I just read, young men and young women are now at risk of being accused of rape and harassment and prosecuted on our campus in campus tribunals which do not have to apply the rules of due process if they simply engage in sexual jokes and unwanted flirtation. The age of Nero? Ask me more about this in the Q&A. So let's go back to the trigger warning that I referenced earlier in my talk. Originally used for the mentally ill to help prevent traumatic stress disorder, trigger warnings have now become the latest rage on college campuses. Student leaders at the University of California, Santa Barbara recently passed a resolution urging university officials to institute mandatory trigger warnings on class syllabi. Professors who offer content that may trigger the onset of symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder would be required not only to issue advance alerts, but also permit students to skip class. If you don't like what someone says, if it upsets you, you can avoid the subject rather than facing it. In this world, sensitivity and civility are deemed equal to, or in fact superior to, academic freedom, a point recently made by the chancellor of UC Berkeley, thankfully to loud disapproval. Now, don't get me wrong. Fostering friendship, solidarity, harmony, and civility are important. But in the words of scholar C. Van Woodward, for all you Yaleys in the room, if we make the fostering of friendship, solidarity, harmony, civility, or mutual respect the primary and dominant value on campus, then we risk sacrificing the university's central purpose, teaching and scholarship. Now, when I was first approached to give this talk, we explored a number of titles, including political correctness and its impact on American competitiveness. In an important way, I think this title understands that what happens on college campuses does not stay on college campuses. First Amendment scholar Greg Lukianoff outlines the problem. Administrators on campus, he writes, have been able to convince well-meaning students to accept outright censorship by creating the impression that freedom of speech is somehow the enemy of social progress. When students began leaving college with that lesson under their belts, it was only a matter of time before the cultivation of bad intellectual habits on campus started harming the dialogue of our entire country. Indeed, what happens on our campuses profoundly influences what happens in our businesses, in our homes, and in our policy making. And I think we should be concerned. The danger of political correctness is not simply to academic freedom. When students are not empowered to think for themselves, when they're not presented with multiple perspectives and disciplines or presentations, and when they are led to believe that they should be free from insult and upset, They are being deprived of the rich education they deserve, the challenging education they deserve. And all of us are being deprived of the thoughtful citizens, prepared workers, and lifelong learners that our society requires. Ask most employers, and you'll understand what I mean. They don't blame political correctness exactly, but they do say in large numbers that they are seeing college graduates who cannot think critically, write clearly, and who are historically illiterate. The last 2 surveys of college graduates conducted by the Department of Education found that a majority were unable to compare perspectives in 2 editorials. Recent surveys conducted for the American Council of Trustees and Alumni by GFK found that college graduates could not identify the terms of members of Congress. They did not know that the Constitution provides for the separation of powers. They thought that D-Day occurred at Pearl Harbor. Now, it is true, and we can all agree, that knowledge is more than rote learning. But when courses don't provide a broad sweep of history and the intellectual tools to put those issues into a meaningful context, and when speech code suggests that free speech must take a back seat to sensitivities, we should not then be surprised that our college graduates are not always prepared for life after graduation, and indeed choose to impose the same principles and the same constraints that they learned on the college campus. Where does social hygiene end and personal liberty and privacy begin? In research now underway, sociologist April Kelly Wiesner tells me that she has found that political intolerance has increased among people graduating from college after 2000. She has found that students are accepting speech limitations and speech codes more so than in the past, including banning certain books and controversial people from teaching. We have taught this generation, she wrote me in an email, that protecting people's feelings is more important than the search for truth. And while speech codes and other symptoms of the politically correct university were aimed to protect minority groups from harmful speech, students today, she reports, do not discriminate, believing that anyone who says something offensive to anyone should be restricted. In the wake of UC Irvine's students' effort to prevent the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. from speaking, former system president Mark Yudof explained what he believed had happened, and I quote, "They believed that constitutional rights were for marginalized groups, not for the privileged. These students took it upon themselves to define privilege, and they made it clear that Jews were among the privileged. Not poor, not marginalized, not the object of empathy. No need to protect the free speech of Jews. Every reason to silence them." In a book entitled Freedom from Speech, and I urge it for all of you, Greg Lukianoff paints an alarming picture. The national obsession with punishing jokes, rants, drunken tirades, and even deeply held beliefs, he writes, shows a growing hostility toward free speech as a cultural value. People all over the globe are coming to expect emotional and intellectual comfort as though it were a right. On the PC campus, respect for the authority of ideas takes a backseat too often to the idea of authority. Now, I'm happy to report after all of this that the American Council of Trustees and Alumni is not at all glum. I'm pleased to relate some very positive actions that have occurred in just recent days. In late August, a group of distinguished policymakers, trustees, faculty, and others, convened by the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, came together to demand a different academic culture. The report, Governance for a New Era, chaired by former Yale President Benno Schmidt, who was one of the very first to talk about the challenges of political correctness, and signed by such luminaries as John Engler, former governor of Michigan and now president of the Business Roundtable, Jonathan Cole, former provost of Columbia, Michael Crow, president of Arizona State, is bold and to the point. The signatories call upon colleges and universities to put an end to disinvitation, to insist on disciplinary diversity, to ensure a strong core curriculum, and to demand the integrity of the hiring process. They call on college and university leaders to make clear that a diversity of opinion is essential, and that the free exchange of ideas is the bedrock of a rich education. They urge presidents, deans, and faculty to address entering students on academic freedom and free expression, and we have already seen this happen with a powerful welcoming speech by the Yale president, Peter Salovey, this fall to incoming freshmen. These leaders state boldly, and I hope you will agree, that American universities must return to first principles. They recognize that the dominance of political correctness on our campuses amounts to nothing short of a war on youth, endangering the empowerment and training of our next generation of leaders. They recognize that American higher education has long been the envy of the world, and that it will continue to be, only if true academic freedom returns as a campus value of paramount importance. So I thank you, and I look forward to Q&A.
Today we are enjoying a Friday Forum featuring Neal, President and co-founder of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. We'll return to our speaker momentarily for a traditional City Club question and answer period, and would ask you to start formulating your questions now, and please try to keep them brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via 90.3 WCPN, WVIZ PBS, 104.9 WCLV Idea Stream, or one of the many radio stations across the region and country that carry City Club programs. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC, and our live webcasts are supported by the University of Akron. 1 week from today, October 10, the City Club welcomes Stephen Vetter, President and Chief Executive Officer of Partners of the Americas. For more information about our upcoming and past forums, please visit us online at www.cityclub.org. Today, we welcome guests at the table hosted by Western Reserve Partners. We thank you very much for your support. And we also welcome students from two high schools, Chardon High School and Maple Heights High School. Student participation was made possible by a generous gift from the Loeb Foundation. We thank you for your support, and I'd like the students to stand up and be recognized. Thank you. Certainly very appropriate that you're here today, and I'm sure you're starting to formulate your questions right now. And speaking of which, we'd like to return now to our speaker for a traditional question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone here today, including guests. Holding the microphones today are Marketing and Outreach Specialist Kirsten Pianka and Content Associate Teddy, where's Teddy? There's Teddy, Teddy Eisenberg. First question, please.
Ms. Neal, thank you for your remarks. You describe an alarming situation. My question is, how did it come about? Is it generated by students? Is it generated by students influenced by faculty who tend to be tenured and largely of one political mindedness? Give us some clarification of this.
No, we could go on for some time, couldn't we? I think there are a number of causes. Now, we can look in the 60s when what is known as postmodernism became a reigning orthodoxy on college campuses. Postmodernism essentially believes that things are relative, and it looks at issues in terms of power. And I think that many of the post-60s faculty very much subscribed to that philosophy, and so that philosophy increasingly became part and parcel of what we have seen on college campuses. I think that is very much the case. I think that there has been within the academic hiring process often a tendency to hire those with whom one agrees. And this issue has come up frequently in the question of whether or not professors are all on one side of the political line. And the American Council of Trustees and Alumni has frankly, we've looked at this, and I think it's fair to say that a number of studies would argue that, in fact, many faculty members are more of one persuasion than another. But our basic perception is that in and of itself is not important. So what we get back to really is professional responsibility and professional rights. And I think this gets back again to the academic freedom definition. When I told you in 1915 the AAUP said that academic freedom was a two-way street, students' freedom to learn and faculty's freedom to teach. one thing that has happened in the last 40 or 50 years is an increasing de-emphasis on students' freedom to learn and an increasing emphasis by faculty on their rights to teach. And I think there's frankly a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of the regular public, but actually the faculty themselves as to what are the limits and what are the framework of academic freedom. And so I think over the years we have seen a growing sense that academic freedom could be used as an excuse for irresponsibility in the classroom. And interestingly, AAUP had a Committee A, which was to be focusing on rights and responsibilities. And they also were going to have a Committee B, which was to look at and police themselves in the event that they were not showing professional responsibility. That committee was never realized. And I think that has been one of the larger problems in the academy, in so much as the faculty themselves have not been willing to police themselves. And the 1915 statement, I think, quite rightly says that we do not want to be policed, and it is incumbent upon ourselves, it is incumbent upon us faculty to police ourselves, because if we do not, others will surely do that for us. And I think that is a situation where we find ourselves now, that many are concerned, rightly so, on the outside, trustees, policymakers, that we are not seeing the students' freedom to learn and the faculty's freedom to teach that true academic freedom should be. And so I think that it really is a defining moment for many faculty as they hear very legitimate complaints from the outside about whether or not they're properly preparing the next generation.
Do you think that before sensitivity reared its ugly head, there was some insensitivity that the sensitivity was responding to? Before the anti-harassment policies came into effect, do you think there was a problem with harassment that, that needed to be responded to? And now that the situation has gotten as you've described it, where do you find the middle ground? And what are the trustees and alumni, not necessarily members of your group, but alumni and trustees doing about this, or other interest groups who may have a problem with these kinds of policies?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you have to be distinctions made between things that are illegal and things that are not. And I think, as I suggested with the definition of sexual harassment, these definitions have gone so broad that they are no longer getting at what is illegal, and they're actually including vast expanses of protected speech. So I think you're right. We don't want to have a college campus that is rude and is engaging and intimidating. Well, I shouldn't say, maybe rude's all right, but we don't want a college campus that is engaged in intimidating, persistent intrusion with people. But that is a level of persistence and intimidation that we're not finding is the line that is drawn by most institutions. Because I think in an effort to respond to a desire to treat people fairly and nicely, we've gone overboard, and then as a consequence now find ourselves in a situation where too many things are off limits.
As a professor at Kent State University, I deeply appreciate your comments. But I'm wondering if the priority of putting political correctness ahead of reasoned discourse is that our society, that instead of it being a cause, that it's a symptom of a broader thing, that our society has lost its appreciation for the well-reasoned, dispassionate discourse of controversial ideas in lieu of the entertainment value of discussion of controversial issues, Jerry Springer show and things like that.
Well, I actually do tend to point my finger at colleges and universities. And I do think that they have perpetuated an atmosphere on the college campus which is not open, which is often not open to the free exchange of ideas, so that people who dare to have a different opinion, whether it's on race, class, and gender, or climate change, or whatever, more often than not silence themselves rather to address these issues. And so rather than complaining about entertainment, I think as we look at our public discourse, which has become increasingly sort of shouting rather than engaging, I regret to say that I do think that we have led students on to believe that sensitivity and civility and not disagreeing is more important than having a robust exchange of ideas. And so while the entertainment may play into that, I feel that we have to really point our finger at our academic institutions, and that the health of our society depends profoundly on the health of our educational institutions. And I think this is one pathology that we need to worry about.
What influenced you to focus on political correctness, and have you ever witnessed or experienced political correctness in your lifetime?
Well, I started out as a First Amendment lawyer, so I've always been interested in First Amendment areas. And quite frankly, as you heard from the head of the organization, there have been any number of recent speeches where people have been shouted down and were not allowed to speak. And so this is something that deeply concerns me, because I think, as I articulated, whether it's Thomas Jefferson or others, the ability to hear differing perspectives so that one can weigh them one side or another, I think, is very, very important. It's just been a bedrock principle of the First Amendment. And I think we can also look at Brandeis and others. What did he say? He said that if you have offensive speech, what's the best answer? More speech, not less. And so I think it comes from my love of the First Amendment. I was a journalist for a period of time. I grew up in a journalistic family. I think that First Amendment and the free exchange of ideas is essential, and I think most profoundly in the country in which we live, because our democratic republic relies on educated citizens. It's something that all of our founding fathers were very emphatic about. And it's interesting to note that our founding fathers were also college and university trustees. And they understood that our educational institutions were instrumental in preparing us for effective citizenship. So that's a long answer to your question, but thank you.
Ms. Neal, in recent years, there have been a significant number of very large contributions to American universities coming from foreign governments and from individuals who have specific agendas. Sometimes these gifts have resulted in chairs being named and departments of studies being established. To what extent do you think that these kind of contributions, which are important to universities, constitute any kind of a problem for academic freedom?
I think you put your finger on a very serious potential threat to academic freedom. And I urge you all to take a look at a booklet that we have put out called Free to Teach, Free to Learn. One of the topics that it talks about is the influence of foreign governments and college and university campuses. And I know you all have probably read recently in Wall Street Journal talking about some of these Confucius institutes as a fear that, frankly, that the governments were paying their way into college and university campuses to put out a particular viewpoint. I think colleges and universities have to be very, very careful before accepting those kinds of gifts. Because again, the whole point of academic freedom is to follow truth wherever it may lead. And if a gift is so prescriptive that it means certain areas are off limits, then it fundamentally undermines academic freedom. It raises another interesting issue as well, because we often help donors who would like to see certain areas of a field covered on a college campus. So for instance, if someone wants to introduce a free market economics course and it's not otherwise available, we encourage donors to do that. And we do it because sometimes students cannot find otherwise on campus exposure to those areas. But it does raise, even in those instances, questions of academic freedom that have to be looked at very closely, and it also underscores the institution's failure itself to provide that diversity of perspective that it needs. And so it's self-correcting. The institutions, if they are open to a diverse range of disciplinary and other perspectives and make those available, they will then find themselves less in the difficulty of dealing with donors who want to prescribe a certain thing, because they will already have done it on college campuses.
Ms. Neal, you have a broader perspective on the topic I'm about to inquire into than most. So I ask you, what pattern, what emerging trend do you see in the envisioned role of three hallowed parts of our educational system: high school, college, and post-college study, advanced study, on two metrics? One is protection of students. Let's focus just on the students for a moment. Protection of students from adverse things that might happen to them, and also on the metric of breadth of study, broad versus specialized and narrow. I see high school in a very special way, college in a different one, and advanced study differently, but I welcome your views.
Mm-hmm. I think that you're right. I think in years past, and I think Bloom talks to this a bit, that you could rely on high school to provide a solid general foundation with exposure to foundational areas of knowledge such as math and science and literature. And I think for better or for worse, that has not been the case, so that colleges and universities do find themselves having to provide that foundation that some of our high schools have not been able to do. Now, as I indicated, what we're finding today is what I like to call the anything goes curriculum. And this gets back to the very first question. I mean, you had the influence of postmodernism, which affected, I think, a lot of things that were taught. But post-World War II, our colleges and universities have frankly been swimming in funds. I mean, the spigot was on ever since the GI Bill. Universities really did not have to pick and choose. They could keep adding. And in fact, Robert Maynard Hutchins at one point called it education by adding machine. So I think, again, this is, professors had things they wanted to teach. Schools really didn't have any limits on their resources, so it was easier just to let teachers teach more and teach more. And so now what we have are often hundreds, even thousands of courses that will meet distribution requirements rather than a prescribed liberal arts education that ensures that foundation. Why is that foundation perhaps even more important than it was now? Again, I think because you are getting so many students who come from very different preparations. And a general education curriculum that is well structured can help bring people from very differing preparations together over a certain set of common material. And this gets back again to the earlier question. I think we worry these days about the range of civil discourse. And this gets back to me again for the lack of a common foundation. In Thomas Jefferson's day, and obviously it's a little easier then, but if you looked at Madison and Jefferson when they were talking to each other, they could be sure that they knew what each other was talking about. They had read the same things and had that same foundation. Now, lots has happened since then. Obviously, there are many more things to look at. But I do think that our colleges and universities are missing out on using the curriculum to provide that common conversation that can help us unite. It won't mean that we all agree, but we will have a foundation on which to have a discussion. I see these kids today who love to watch The Voice and other shows, and I love those shows too. But I think one of the reasons that they find them so enjoyable is that that then becomes the common conversation that they have. Instead of talking about a book that they're reading in common, they're talking about The Voice or what they saw on television. So I do feel that we are at a time where we can help that common conversation, and we can help our preparation for life and for community and for civic engagement if we go back to a much more structured curriculum that will ensure that we all have that broad exposure, and that will also, I think, make us much more nimble in an economy where between the ages of 18 and 45, on average, someone will have 11 different professions. And so having that foundation and having that breadth, I think, is what in our current economy we really need, but regrettably we don't have.
Ms. Neal, you've essentially made the argument for the small liberal arts president who says we need a basic liberal arts agenda for our students. My question is, I have two questions. One is, can you give us some examples of colleges or universities that have kept the broad curriculum with standards And the other area I'd be interested in is people who have resisted the political correctness of disinviting speakers because they're controversial, that have specifically programmed controversial. And the second part of the question is, are these positive examples more typical of the small liberal arts colleges, the larger public institutions and maybe nationally known institutions, or maybe the group in between, you know, the regional colleges, the sort of mid-sized like Cleveland State here university?
We did an assessment of the top-rated liberal arts colleges according to U.S. News and World Report, the Amhersts of this world, the Williamses, the Bowdens. And I must confess to you that these are probably the worst when it comes to having a prescribed liberal arts curriculum. We often hear that people no longer appreciate liberal arts education, and we often hear this from the campuses. But after we did this research to see what was the framework of the curriculum that was offered to these students, we came away with the conclusion that there was nothing wrong with the liberal arts, that what was wrong was the way the colleges and universities were imparting the liberal arts. It was a self-inflicted wound, where essentially, again, you can go to Amherst, they pride themselves in saying, we don't have anything that we require, we allow students to make their own curriculum. And I'm not denying that the kids that go to Amherst are those who, it's a highly selective institution, has many, many very smart students, and I'm sure have been well prepared. But it's interesting to look at a new book, which again I commend to everyone, called Academically Adrift by Richard Aram and Josippa Roxa. It was put out by the University of Chicago. What they found there was that after $200,000 of investment, students were graduating with very little cognitive gain. In the first 2 years, they found that only 45% had cognitive gain, and I think in the 6 years, and that's a whole different issue which we haven't gotten into, only a third showed cognitive gain. And within institutions was where they found greater variety. That is by way of saying, so you might be well prepared coming into Amherst and could do fine, but there is great variation within these highly selective institutions, so that some students are being allowed to graduate without that foundation and that fundamental strength that they need and should merit coming out of a very pricey liberal arts college. Now, do I have some examples of some very good places? Sewanee is certainly a place that we have looked at and have found to be quite impressive. They have not only been attentive to their tuition, but they do have a strong curriculum. In terms of others, there is a small liberal arts public college in Oklahoma that has done a beautiful job in, I think it's called the College of Oklahoma Arts and Sciences, again, a very strong curriculum. Bluefield College in Virginia, again, a very strong curriculum. So there are schools, and in fact, interestingly, there are schools now which are viewing this as a means to carve out a niche and a means to compete, because they are then able to say, if you send your child to our institutions, you can be assured that that student will receive a strong core curriculum. Now, this isn't to say that you can't get a good education at almost any institution. You can, but you will have to do it yourself. And the American Council of Trustees and Alumni believes it really is incumbent on the adults who are in charge of our colleges and universities to make the choices and to make the judgments about what students need to know and be able to do. Because if they're not going to make those judgments, then I can sit at home and I can take MOOCs and I can do the teaching company and I can teach myself and make my own judgments, because frankly that's what I would have been doing at the college campus, but I'll be $200,000 wealthier. So I do think that this is really what we're calling upon. It's a hard job. It's a job that faculty don't like to undertake, because all faculty are in fields that they love, and each one of them feels that his or her field is the most important field. But in fact, you can't teach everything in your 4 years, and I think that it's important for institutions to have this debate. They won't all come out with the same answer, but they will have come together as a community to try to decide what they believe a graduate institution should know and be able to do. And that way the marketplace will also have a signifier. They will know that if you go to this place, you will have gotten this kind of an education. The way it is today, since it is so diffuse, and so it is where it is pick and choose on behalf of students, an employer can't really know what that particular graduate will have studied or have learned, because there's just really no set curriculum that can be guaranteed.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have enjoyed a Friday Forum featuring Ann Neal, President and co-founder of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Thank you very much, Ms. Neal, for your informative remarks. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.